I am Dr. Megan Connell. I am a psychologist, and I use tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, as a tool in therapy. And even though this is the technology symposium, I'm going to be talking to you about an analog game that is also played digitally sometimes, but what we're doing with this game and explaining how it's used and going over everything. A little bit about me. I am a psychologist in private practice out in Charlotte, North Carolina. I practice virtually in all of the states that are participating in the PsyPact. I helped develop a training program for teaching applied gaming, and I also teach my own course on applied gaming. And I have a book coming out on this very subject early next year that I am super excited about. And so what are we going to be talking about today? So I'm going to define what a role-playing game is for you, specifically looking at the tabletop side of things, for those who are not familiar with it, why we are using tabletop role-playing games in therapy, and what we can achieve through doing this. My hope is that through the first part of this discussion, I'm going to really entice you all to want to learn more about this. And we're going to talk about where you can find different training programs and activities to learn more about how to use gaming in applied settings. I'm going to try to leave about 5 to 10 minutes at the very end for questions and discussion. But if you have questions throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat. If I can answer them as we're going, I will. If not, I'll try to leave them for the very end. So really quickly, what are tabletop role-playing games? So this is a really broad subject. They've been around for a long time, and a lot of times when we're thinking about role-playing games, we might be thinking about video games. And now something that's really interesting is, like with many things out there, there's not really an agreed upon definition. But generally speaking, and talking in this very broad sense, I just realized I'm wearing the same shirt today as I'm wearing in that picture. A role-playing game is a game in which one person controls a character that exists within the world of the game. So it's really these three pieces that are vitally important here, is that a player has agency over a character. That character exists within the world and within the gaming world and has to follow the rules of that gaming world. And so they are abiding by those rules and laws that are within that setting. And so again, these can be board games, video games, tabletop games, all types of games can have a role-playing aspect. But let's talk a little bit about what are the differences between tabletop gaming versus video games. So really one of the biggest issues is the impact of coding. So though video games are getting more and more open and more sandboxy, you are still always going to be limited by the coding of that game. So in order to do anything in a video game, the person who created that game and who created the code of that game has to have kind of thought about how these different pieces interact together and put them together in a meaningful way. So there's many games out there where maybe you have an idea of how you want to solve a problem. You want to, I remember seeing an example of somebody playing, I think it was The Last of Us, and they're going through the tutorial level and they saw a path that they wanted to go down, but it was basically the art didn't match the code of the game. And so it looked like there was a place that they could go that they couldn't, and they were getting very frustrated. And they're like, the game wants me to go this way, but that's not what I want to do. I want to go the other way. And so as immersive and fun and amazing as video games can be, at the end of the day, it's still code, and it's still, we're following the rules according to somebody else. In a Dungeons and Dragons game or tabletop role-playing game, the code is your imagination. I didn't come up with that code. That's from Kate Walsh, and formerly of Wizards of the Coast. She now kind of works independently in the gaming world. But I love that whatever you can imagine, you can do within the game. It's a very, in some ways, intimidating thing for people, for others, very liberating and opening. And so it's this really interesting thing. Now, some people might be going, well, wait a second, if we're only limited by our imagination, that can become very chaotic very quickly, can it? Because now people can do kind of anything, anywhere. Not so. Let's go back a slide and look at our definition of role-playing games. So let's say I'm playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons or something, and I'm getting to a situation, I'm like, you know what? I really want my character to fly right now. We don't just get to go, my character starts flying, unless we have an ability that fits within the rules of that world. Is our character a species of, that can fly? Do they have wings? Are they able to fly? Do they have magic that allows them to fly? Do they have an item that allows them to fly? If they don't have those things, they can still try to achieve that goal, but just sort of like in our day-to-day life, like we can decide like, man, you know what? I would really love to fly. And we can sort of do that. We are limited by the rules of the physics of this world. And so in the same sense, we can do that in role-playing games where we can want to do something, but because we're controlling a character that exists within the world, to keep the game going, we have to kind of abide by the rules of that world. And so it's really an interesting thing that happens. Now, one of the really, really cool things about tabletop gaming, role-playing games, and I think more specifically tabletop role-playing games, is the level of immersion that people feel. And this is sort of how much does the player get swept into the narrative of the game. And this is where we're going to start seeing a little of these crumbs that lead us to why these are such great tools for therapy. And we have research from literature that shows that if people just read fiction, measures of empathy indicate that they have increased empathy. So the increased ability to identify and understand the emotional experiences of others is increased through reading fictional works. The more a person identifies with the character that they're reading about, the greater that emotional growth. And so I argue that if you have created a character that's basically acting as the main character in a story, that you would be able to have even more growth in empathy. And a lot of that, again, immersion matters. The more immersed we are in experience, the more meaningful that experience is going to be with us. And so, if we think about some games are not very immersive, but they are role-playing games. So like board games like Charterstone, that Harry Potter Battle of Hogwarts game that you see there, they're technically role-playing games. You're taking on the persona of a character that exists within the world, but you don't necessarily identify with that character a lot. You're not feeling incredibly immersed by being that experience of being that character. You can get into some immersion too, like role-playing games on video game consoles. Like games like Stardew Valley can be very immersive, and it seems like the level of immersion is indicated a lot by how much you have meaningful choices within that gaming world. So the more meaningful your choices are, the more likely you are to be immersed within the world. And so it's a really interesting experience. I love seeing all that. There's a lot of text going on here, people talking about the different spells, fly spells. I love it. You guys are my people. And so the more we're immersed in a story, the more that has that emotional hit for us. If we think about the video games or other gaming experiences that have hit us the most, usually it's we identify with the character heavily, we identify with the story heavily, or we were able to do something that really felt impactful and meaningful. And you've listened to the games where people feel that the most, it is that immersion that seems to be a really big key here. Now, something you maybe have picked up on, I'm using a lot of language of it seems as though this looks like something. And one of the big things I'm going to lament about tabletop role-playing games is we do not have a lot of formal research. We actually have almost no formal research on the use of tabletop games and D&D and everything in particular. Why that is, I think honestly it's because of the Satanic Panic. Researchers got scared and didn't want to ask for grants and funds to research D&D when it had such bad press, and started studying video games, and then that research really took off and tabletop gaming just kind of got left behind even once things settled down. By the way, I guess I'll just say this: playing tabletop role-playing games does not lead to Satan worship. One of the fears of the Satanic Panic was actually that playing a role-playing game and being immersed would decrease your connectivity with what was real. And so we only have one really large-scale study on tabletop role-playing games, and that was done by Gary Allen Fine. It was published first in 1983. And he noted something really interesting, that those who played games like D&D had to have their minds set in 3 distinct frames. And those were the frames of the player, the rules of the game, and the character. And anytime there was confusion between these roles, the game just kind of fell apart. So it's this interesting idea that we had this fear that playing games like D&D could create a distortion of reality, that we start questioning who we are, we start believing the narrative of the game, all of this stuff. But that just doesn't hold true. That the more we are able to hold these frames separately, the more fun we can have in the game. And so, for example, if my character is fighting or arguing with a non-player character that the DM is controlling, and me as a person, I'm getting mad at the DM and I start making personal attacks against that person, that's problematic because I've now had confusion between the character and myself as a player, and the game starts falling apart at that point. Or if we're engaging with just the rules, but we're not talking about the world setting, that creates a problem as well, because then we're not fully buying into frame 2, which is the rules of the game. Interestingly, again, this was in the study published, I think, in the late 70s or early 1980s, where a couple of psychologists actually were running a game for people in a, if I'm remembering the study correctly, it was a locked unit for a couple of folks with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And what they found held true with what Fine found is that as long as the patient was able to hold on to the frames of reality and separate themselves from their character, they could play fine. And actually, they gained a lot of social skills and had a lot of fun and enjoyment. And it's a case study, so it's just a lot of anecdotal evidence of personal growth through playing the game. It's interesting that hasn't been replicated. It's just a one-off study, but it is interesting to show that these fears that we have, that playing fantasy games, playing role-playing games, really don't impact our ability to reality test. And in fact, the ability to separate fantasy from reality is central to being able to successfully play a role-playing game. So it seems like we've got a lot of folks here who are quite familiar with terms and things associated with role-playing games, but I still want to go over a few that people might not have heard of or have questions about. So a player character, or a PC here, is the character that the person controls in the game. So in the picture here, my PC was that Dragonborn bard named Torina. She was punk rock. She was awesome. She got to level 20. It was great. A non-player character are the other characters that exist within the world that your characters are going to interact with. The game master or dungeon master, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, controls all the NPCs in the world, as well as the monsters and everything, the terrain, the forests, everything. In tabletop role-playing games, we utilize dice. Most games use a dice like this. It's called a D20. It's called that because it has 20-sided dice, 20 sides, sorry. The D stands for dice, and then the number following it is for how many sides. So D20, my beautiful D12 here of prismatic glass, D10s, we've got D8s. This is, okay, sorry guys, this is an excuse for me to show off some of my beautiful dice. D6s, and then two styles of, D4s. I like this style a little better, but this little kind of pyramid-y style is pretty common. A session, I have many dice. A session is a single meeting of a game. So this is where you just play through a section of the story. You could almost think of it as like a chapter in a book. A campaign is the book itself, is the whole story from start to finish. Now, campaigns can actually last one session. They're called one-shots. It can all be self-contained within one session, or they can go on and on and on. There's actually a dungeon master in, I think, Canada who's been running the same campaign for close to 40 years, which is absolutely amazing, I think. A module is a pre-published adventure that people can go on. So it's a campaign that's already been created for you that you can run from start to finish. The term on the rails or railroading refers to when a game master is forcing their players to go down a certain pathway, as opposed to sandboxing, which is where the world is more open. A good video game example of this might be the Zelda series. So Zelda, the very first one, was very much so on the rails. Like, you literally could not go off the path. You had to stay on the path. Now with Breath of the Wild, once you're out the tutorial, you can go anywhere, but there is still a frame around the sandbox. And so that's not to say that there's complete limitations, but there are some. And so with railroading, a lot of times that's seen as less fun if it's not done well. Again, we want to make these games immersive. And part of how a game feels immersive seems to be the level of control and agency you have over your player character. And so if no matter what you do, something is going to happen, it doesn't feel very immersive. I remember watching someone playing Red Dead Redemption 2, and there was an NPC that they were entertaining and they were fun, and then a situation happens and that NPC dies. And I was like, man, can you do anything to save that NPC? And the person who's playing was like, no, I've looked it up online. Like, there's not a single decision tree you can make that results in getting to save that NPC, no matter what they die. It's like, well, that's dumb. That's not fun. I don't want to play that. So it's a really interesting thing that it's okay to kind of nudge players along a storyline, but you still want their decisions to matter. Sometimes when we are having people roll dice to see if they are successful or not in a endeavor, we have them roll with advantage. So this means they get to roll 2d20s, they take the higher roll. Disadvantage is the opposite. You roll 2d20s, you take the lower roll. XP are your experience points. HP are your health points or heroic points. I'm going to do a quick pitch for heroic points as opposed to health. Health doesn't really increase as you get more experience. Like, we are no more hardy as humans at level 1 versus level 100. It's more that the heroic points, this idea of the more experience we have, the better we get at dodging attacks, the better we get at, taking a blow. And so I like this idea that the more heroic you are, the more ability you have to overcome things in battle. And I think that's a little bit more realistic and understandable, and just also kind of fun to explain how suddenly you're able to survive encounters that would have killed you a few levels ago. I like the rest mechanics because this has a lot of cool things to bring in for us as humans as well, which is the idea of a short rest, which is an hour that you take to patch yourself up and feel a little bit better, and a long rest, which is 8 hours of continuous rest to feel better. Difficulty class, or DC, is how difficult a challenge is to overcome. And so that is going to be a numeric value that the game master determines, and then the players have to roll against. So, if I'm trying to sneak past a distracted guard, that DC might be 10. If I'm trying to scale a wall that doesn't have any good handholds on it, that DC might be 20. It sort of just depends on what the game master thinks the difficulty of something would be. Metagame is a skill, or is a undesirable behavior done by players where they take knowledge that their characters shouldn't have, and they utilize that in the game in a way that does not make it very fun. So, like, the players are encountering a puzzle or a monster, and the player has knowledge of, like, oh, this monster is vulnerable to this thing. It's like, your character has no reason to know that, and it's not very fun to just immediately go for the thing that your character doesn't know. So it's an interesting way. Again, metagaming is part of frame confusion. Essentially, it's taking the knowledge of that player and influencing the knowledge of the character. All right, so all of this, what on earth does a tabletop role-playing game look like? What do we see? So you're going to see players sitting around a table. Typically, one is acting as your game master, and you can have one or more players. Most games go around 4 to 6 players. Some games go up to like 8 or 10. It really depends on the comfort level of the game master wanting to run the games. For applied games, I recommend no more than 6 players. I like having 6 players because we have an even number to do splits if we need to. It's also enough that if a couple people don't come to a session, we have enough players to continue on with the story. Tabletop gaming, like any hobby, can get really expensive without necessarily needing to. You don't really need anything super fancy to run a game of D&D. A map of some kind can be very helpful. Having something to represent the heroes and the monsters on the table can be helpful as well. That can be dice, it can be minis, it can be cough drops. I ran a game at a convention where we didn't have minis, but what we did was we put down dice, And you don't need, it's just good to have 8 sets of dice, though. We put down dice as the enemies because the dice were trying to hurt us, and cough drops as the heroes because cough drops help us. And it worked great. You don't need to have really fancy equipment. It can just be fun to have. I think it's also worth noting that I think we can tell ourselves this, I guess, validation of like, well, if I have more fancy equipment, it's going to up the immersive experience of the players, and they're going to have a more emotional growth as a result of more immersion and more fancy things, right? Not exactly. Again, we don't have evidence of this, but I have played plenty of games where there's lots of fancy props on the table and games where there's nothing. And I'll tell you, one of the most meaningful, powerful games I ever played was a game where we had no minis, we had no map. It was just one of the players in a group I was part of was like, I'm going to run a Halloween horror game for us, and made it up right on the spot. And it was amazing. It was super fun and scary and wonderful. And you don't need a lot of things to make that happen. You just need to have an imagination and to do things. Now, some people in chat are talking about this idea. It's called theater of mind. That's where we're describing things openly and having people engage. Now, it's a really helpful thing. Like, you don't need a map, like I said, but we do want to keep in mind working memory. 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information in our brain at any given time. If we have 5 players and 3 enemies, we've already outmaxed a lot of folks' working memory. And we're trying to keep pieces of, where people are, what's happening in the world. And that can be really difficult. And so while, this stuff isn't necessary, a lot of it can be helpful. And again, the map does not need to be fancy. It can just be a bit of grid, kind of a good kind of life hack if you're dipping your toe into role-playing games and you're not sure if you want to spend the money on a map. A lot of wrapping paper nowadays has 1-inch grids on the back. And so it's a really cheap way to get maps, and it also doubles as wrapping paper, so you can double purpose something to play around and see if it's something that you might enjoy doing. So one of the things when we're talking about running a game, what that looks like is the game master is going to present a scenario and then ask for feedback from the players, and then they're going to use that feedback to help change and shape the narrative of the story. And so if we say, after long weeks of travel, you found it at the entrance to the dungeon. Your rogue struggled a bit with the lock, but eventually was able to get the lock to disengage. And as the door slid back, a musty, damp smell hit your nose. Everyone roll perception checks. And maybe so people roll, call out their numbers. 5, 8, we got 18, we got some nat ones, a 16, right? I'd say on an 18, just as the doors finish moving, you faintly hear a slight groan that reminds you of an undead that you fought several weeks ago. What do you do? And this is an amazing power, right? The party might choose to go forward. They might choose to retreat. They might choose to cast a fireball. It all depends on the group and what their goals are and what they want to do. And so it can be an incredibly powerful and immersive experience. And so I hope I've interested you a bit in tabletop games, but why on earth would psychologists want to use them? Is this just a ploy for us to legitimize our dice collections and our fandoms? Well, I mean, partly. No, it's not. There's actually seems to be a lot of benefit for using tabletop games. Now, first off, in psychology, there is a long history of using role-playing. If we think back to the psychodrama, it is a very, very powerful tool to help people work through different events in their life. The research on psychodrama and engaging in psychodrama is quite good and hopeful. Like, if people engage with psychodrama, they're going to be able to process through some really difficult topics and learn a lot in the process. The problem is people don't necessarily want to engage in an activity where they have to be that vulnerable. Adults especially have a very difficult time being vulnerable in front of other adults. So role playing, asking to play yourself, even asking to like role play through a scenario that we want to do. Oh, I meant to ask for something. That, when we think though about playing a character, it is incredibly powerful because having that role-playing proxy of the character can really open up the experience. In my book, in the research for my book, I found this interesting study where a psychology professor decided to start using techniques from film writing in teaching his interviewing class. And so during the clinical interviewing class, what they did was, as a class, they used a questionnaire to help develop a character. So coming up with this character, coming up with their history, some of their hobbies, the things they did well, things they struggled with, and basically made a character sheet. And then for the rest of the year, anytime somebody needed to role play out doing a session of some kind, they didn't have to come up with the patient character. That character sheet that the class created was the patient every single time. Now, how they got played was slightly different depending on who was playing them. But what the professor noted was people were much more engaged with role playing. They were much more willing to play the role of the patient, and there wasn't as much nerves around doing the role playing scenarios in class. And so that really shows us that this idea of having a proxy, this idea of having a stand-in really helps open us up and allows us to have permission to take a risk. So again, like we as a person might not want to stand in the middle of the field and give a battle cry. But if we put on a costume and have a sword and a shield and a helmet, suddenly like it doesn't feel so silly to stand up and give that battle cry. Like we're role playing, we are a character. It's not me, the serious psychologist. It's my character going out and doing it. The other thing that seems to be really helpful with role-playing games is just how adaptive they are. Because they are, this open world where pretty much anything can happen, we can adapt the scenarios to the needs of the group that we're working with. So for example, if the point is to get from point A to point B to get a MacGuffin of some kind, if I'm having a group that needs to work on social skills, well, I'm going to put a social encounter in the way of the MacGuffin. They have to talk their way past a monster, or they have to solve a riddle. They have to communicate somehow to talk through the scenario. If I have a group that is trying to learn how to work together and to trust and to be part of a team, well, I'm going to give them some sort of puzzle that requires each person to do something different and to communicate and to work well together. Again, same scenario, point A, point B, with a challenge in the middle, but that challenge we can change to meet the needs of our group. Also, games are intrinsically rewarding. We love overcoming challenges. In her great book, was Reality is Broken, Dr. Jay McGonigal talks about this. That's part of gaming, is that we have an obstacle that we have to overcome in this gaming world. And it is just so much fun to overcome them in the game. And when we overcome that obstacle finally, we get this huge rush, and it's very rewarding. It also is helpful when we're using things that people like. Growth, becoming a better version of ourselves, reflecting on our bad habits, reflecting on the things we need to change, it is probably the most difficult thing that people can do. If all change involved was knowing what you needed to do differently, I wouldn't have a job as a psychologist. Change is incredibly painful and difficult. And so getting to engage in this activity that gives you this reward is really helpful. And also, because the story, the setting, everything is very, very adaptable, it's a very easy way to bring in special interests. My business partner and one of my good colleagues, Dr. Ryan Kelly, did a study where he found that if you can include the special interests of children on the autism spectrum in their treatment modality, their treatment outcomes improve. And so if we get a group of kids together who love anime and we have them play through the Avatar: The Last Airbender role-playing game, and they're all interested in it, and they're getting to be benders, and they get to exist in this world that they are humongous fans of, they're going to dive into that much more. They're going to really be engaged and connected to that. And so it is really, really powerful to have that setting and to have, have that intrinsically rewarding task. It seems like the results we get from this are really good. Again, I say seems there because we haven't had formalized studies. I will say for me, my dropout rate for tabletop games as opposed to just treatment as usual is so much less. Like, people love being in these games. They don't even realize they're learning stuff as they play, and it really seems to help people. Also, like, again, this is anecdotal evidence. Some folks that I trained who were running a group for, I believe, the University of Wisconsin Counseling Center, their D&D groups filled first, and filled, I think, usually same day they opened. And so it started getting everybody else at the counseling center to go, wait a second, what's going on here? Why are these groups filling so quickly? And so again, like, if we can get people to come in and engage with the therapy, we're going to have much better results than if they don't engage at all. And also, we can learn a lot from our characters. There seems to be some really good research that does indicate that, again, we know this, role-playing is rehearsal, and so rehearsal helps us learn. But this idea has been, studied pretty well by Dr. Sarah Lynn Bowman. So she has studied live-action role-playing, which are called LARPing. She calls the term from learning from your characters bleed. I'm proposing a different term to be used clinically, which is emotional permeability. The reason for this is I have tried to write clinical notes where I talk about bleed happening in my games. And when I take that step back and I read it as a person who does not know anything about role-playing and role-playing games and role-playing therapy, it's like, what the hell does this mean? It just reads really strangely. And so when you put in emotional permeability, that starts to give a little bit more clarity as to what that can be. It's like, okay, so we're talking about having a proxy in the world and experiencing an emotional reaction from that proxy. And that seems to be very helpful. It's a proposed term. If it doesn't take off, that's okay, but it is something that I have proposed. With bleed, we talk about two forms of it, though. Bleed out, which is where something moves from the character into the player. So this is where your character overcomes a very big challenge, and you as a human get a humongous rush. And you feel euphoric. You feel on top of the world about it. Bleed in is when it moves from the player to the character. So this is where maybe I was formerly in the military, and so maybe sometimes my military knowledge bleeds into my character. Or I've had a super duper bad day, and now I'm role-playing my character as being grumpy and all of that kind of stuff. And so between these two, we could start to learn a lot. Dr. Bowman, in one of her books, I wish I could remember which one of the many that I've cited in her work, she talked about how in a LARPing group, this one player was playing a character who was very, very charismatic and very charming and good at repairing relationships and being understanding. And in their real life, they got into a really big fight with their partner, and they didn't know how to solve it. But then they realized their character would know how to solve it. And so they said that they channeled their character and kind of asked their character advice, followed that advice, and were able to successfully repair their relationship with their partner. And like, that can sound a little strange, but it's a way for us to teach ourselves. Our characters can teach us so much about us. They are this mirror that somehow is able to get past our defensive walls and really cut to the heart of what we need and how we grow and how we develop. And so it's a really fascinating way to learn and to see all of this happen. When we're talking about applied gaming, myself and Dr. Boca Mazzaro came up with a fourth frame. So we talked about the three frames from Fine, the player, the rules of the game, and the character. When we're talking about applied gaming, it's also the intervention that we're bringing into the game. I use acceptance and commitment therapy, and so that's what I bring into my games, that we're going to utilize skills from ACT to learn diffusion, to learn acceptance, to learn mindfulness, to be in the here and now, to articulate values and living by those values. And how we weave that into the game is really powerful and can be very, very helpful. I'm starting to run a little short on. I could go on and on about this. The training where we talk about this using these different frames of therapy. It's actually a 6-hour training set, and I'm summarizing it in like a minute here, so it's a lot. And that training, I will talk about where to get trainings, but that one is available through Geek Therapeutics. I helped to co-develop a certification in becoming a therapeutic game master through Geek Therapeutics. And as I said at the beginning, I also run my own trainings as well. And so again, it's these 4 frames that help us understand. So we can take an intervention as usual. So something like, again, learning how to diffuse from unhelpful thoughts. And we want to teach people how to do that. Well, we can bring that into a role-playing game. So we can create there's some awesome monsters that like whisper into your brain, right? So we introduce this character that will whisper into your brain and say things like, you're going to fail. You can't do this. And so how do we help that player get their character to stop believing those voices or to not listen to them and to recognize that they're not helping and to move in a different direction? And so that's that frame. So it's the intervention that we're doing, the goals and objectives that we have for the group, and then we utilize those other 3 frames to help walk the people in the group through that. So what can be achieved through using tabletop role-playing games? A lot of the groups out there across the world are focusing on social skills. So there's lots of groups just focusing specifically on social skills for those on the autism spectrum or with pretty severe ADHD. Creative problem solving. I saw that Adam Davis is going to be one of the presenters that's going to be here later. He tells a story of one of the games he ran, giving his players a box of endless pineapples. And he was shocked at how many problems pineapples could solve. And it was just, he said that that group always went to pineapples first. And it's a really interesting way to start really thinking outside the box. And you can see this pretty quickly. In a just quick one-shot game I ran, I had somebody they were fighting a cold dragon. And one of the players was looking through their character sheet and they're like, I see on my character sheet I have a bedroll. Yep, you do. I also have a lamp. Yes. That lamp have oil in it? Yeah, sure. It has oil. Cool. So here's what I want to do. I want to take the oil. I want to douse my bedroll with it. I want to light it on fire and I want to throw it at the dragon because it's a cold dragon. I assume it's going to be hurt by fire. That's cool. Name a video game where you could do that, right? That was amazing. And I loved that. And it was a really cool idea. Also, working as part of a team. Again, another study that was done in the early 1980s was an intervention done for a youth facility for at-risk youth in New York. And they just had them playing D&D. There wasn't even like a goal to it. But what the people who were running the game found was those in the D&D group, they started learning conflict resolution. They started understanding how it was really important to work with a team of people who had different skills, that if everybody had the same skill set, that would be really problematic. And they wanted a variety of people around them. And that just came from playing the game without needing any extra stuff tied into it. Reading comprehension is a huge part of tabletop games. There's a lot of rules. Like 5th edition, so this is the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. When it first came out, it had 3 books. Now it's got 30, I think, maybe, and lots of new rules, lots of nuance to the spells. And so the better you can read, a lot of times the more engaged you can be with the story. That's not to say you have to read to engage with it. I have young kids who play the game. They don't read the rule books. They're not interested in that, but they still have fun. But it really reinforces reading. It also could help you learn assertiveness skills. That's how I've used it with my groups a lot. My groups are explicitly for those who identify as female, learning about how to set boundaries and how to say no and how to stand up for themselves. And it works beautifully. You can also teach stress management, conflict resolution, and a number of other things. And again, I have to say that there have not been formalized studies done. This is all anecdotal evidence. So let's talk about where can we learn more about this. So as I said, I do offer my own 10-week training. I'm going to be starting that up next week. I do have some spots in that. Through Game to Grow, there's training. There's also a group called the Bohana Group. They do trainings as well, and so does Leyline Geek Therapeutics. So those are the three primary ones are Geek Therapeutics, Game to Grow, and Bohana. each one is quite different in their approach, which I think is a humongous strength to the field, that we have different ways of integrating these skills and bringing this all together. And so you can contact me for more direct information on where you could find out more for those. As I said, I also have a book coming out, shameless plug, is going to be coming out in March of 2023, where I do talk about what research there is, the fundamental underpinnings, how you run applied games. I talk through how to think through the ethics, how to think through issues of diversity, and all of that with that gaming group. So I've been talking for about 40 minutes, but I see we're on 45. So hopefully I've left enough time for questions and discussion. Please feel free to reach out to me. Copy down my contact information, send me an email. Don't reach out to me on Facebook. I don't ever check Facebook. I just went in onto Facebook the other day and I found I had messages that were like 3 years old from people reaching out. So please message me on Twitter or through my website or through email. That's a way better method of getting in contact with me. But if anybody has questions or points that they want to bring up, I see people are talking about using simplified rule sets. So taking rules and kind of paring them down. And I talk about D&D a lot. And I do this not because D&D is the best game for therapy or because it's the best game for these interventions. I do it because it's the system I know the best. And it is the most popular system out there. There's a couple of other systems I really like, one of them being Outbreak Undead, where the stats of the character are actually based off of you as a player. So you're playing a proxy of yourself in this post-apocalyptic world with a zombie outbreak going on. And I think it's a really, really cool rule set, but it's not played very often. All right. Why D&D and where that is not. Oh, the elevator pitch for parents. So how I talk about this is I say, so I utilize a tabletop role-playing game called Dungeons & Dragons as a therapy tool. What this is we sit around a table, we roll dice and tell a story together. And through that story, I will weave in different interventions and different opportunities for your kids to practice skills that they're learning in therapy. It gives them a safe environment where they can practice this stuff with feedback and without any negative consequences happening in their real world. And also because it is a fun game that they're going to hopefully really enjoy playing, it doesn't feel like therapy. It doesn't feel like growing in the same way. But from what I've seen with my other players, it seems to be a very effective tool. So that's my quick pitch that I give to parents. And honestly, I will say this too, like a lot of parents, once they hear like, wait a second, my kid's going to sit around a table and actually talk to people and not be in their phone the whole time. They're like, yeah, can I just sign up now? So that's a really big selling point. I'm guessing you're meaning what age for the client. So it's what age do you start using D&D for therapy? I generally start not at an age, but a grade. So middle school. So I start with middle schoolers going up through adulthood. I have heard of games going younger, but I generally for individual therapy, I like working with people aged around 14 and up, but I will go a little younger if needed. So that's just my comfort level. For most normative gamers, are there volunteers? Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so for the more normative gamers, are there volunteer organizations out there that we could partner with and bring someone on site to help? What I would say is like, look at your local game stores. So stores that sell board games often will host nights where they're running something called Adventures League or having different people come in and just run games. And so sometimes it can be helpful that's a good place to go and to meet people who run games if you're trying to find game masters to come into your setting, or if you just want to talk and see about how they go about running the games and if they would want your help. Sometimes it's just helpful to sit down and talk with the people who are running the games of how do I help people who have autism or ADHD, or what are some things I can do with people who get anxious at the table. Another shameless plug here, I actually made a series called Psychology at the Table through my media company, Geeks Like Us, where I talk about how game masters can help their players who are struggling with different mental health issues. Do I do a post-session talk back with my players to review what they learned and practice? If so, what does that look like? Yes, I will try to go over to GatherTown for a little bit and answer questions as well. It's an interesting thing. That's like sometimes I will explicitly talk to my players about what they learned. A example of this that I think was really fun was I had a player who hated standing up for themselves and like just wouldn't stand up for themselves. And so I created this really, really frustrating encounter where they had to get to the top of a wizard's tower. And there seemed to be no rhyme or reason to get to the top of the wizard's tower. Spoiler alert, the wizard's tower was chutes and ladders. And they just had buttons they had to push, and either a ladder came down or the floor opened up. And so I developed the encounter to really help people get frustrated. And so this player character and player were both, so we had some bleed going on, incredibly frustrated. And so I started role-playing the mage at the top of the tower, who was very indifferent and rude to them. And I was standing up, walking around being this rude person. And this player got up in my face and pointed and yelled at me and was demanding and just stood up for themselves and stood up for what they wanted. And I was like, okay, pause the game for a second. You just stood up to yourself. You just stood up for somebody. What was that like? And that was this thing where they didn't even realize again what had happened. They're like, well, no, that was my character. I'm like, yeah, but you did it. You stood up to me, an authority figure, and yelled. What was that like? And it was this really big kind of aha moment and turning point for them to be like, oh my God, I can stand up for myself. This is something I could do. And so, in that moment, I process it as it happens. A lot of times, we know from behaviorism, the closer to the behavior the reward can come in, the more effective that is. And also we don't want to delay it too much. So it is talking about this stuff through. And if any of you ever attend my trainings, when I talk about building up therapeutic encounters, I talk about it in terms of creating opportunities for people to practice a skill set. We don't want to railroad and force them to practice something, but we want to give them that opportunity. So for example, if somebody's wanting to learn how to trust other people, you want to give them opportunities in the game to trust NPCs or to trust the other players. I will sometimes talk about it of like, hey, you said you wanted to work on this. You've passed up a few opportunities to do that. Here's another opportunity. I'm not saying you have to, but you could. And so there's these different opportunities there.